Hello and welcome to episode 152 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking about, we got a little bit to talk about, but the power rankings are the big thing. We haven't updated our power rankings in over a month. It feels like it was probably right after the break started. So maybe it's even been closer to 2 months now, but we're finally ready to update those power rankings just in time for the Major 2 qualifiers. We also have some roster mania stuff that we can talk about, some confirmations, some new news. Not as much as we were expecting, as Bink was saying before the show went live, but we will still talk about it nonetheless. And then we will give our predictions and our picks for the first week of the Major 2 qualifiers, which begin this weekend. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Went on the longest losing streak in League of Legends that I've ever been on in my life just before we went live here. So um, that could have been better. But other than that, yeah, we got some fun COD stuff to talk about. So ready to jump right in.
So we'll wait to do the power rankings a little bit later in the show, right before we do the pick'em. That kind of seems like a pretty easy lead in. So let's roll through this roster mania stuff first. I think we start with the stuff that we already kind of knew. Neptune was confirmed earlier today as part of the new Vancouver Surge lineup. We've been talking about this over the last few episodes since it was reported that he was one of the leading candidates to replace Hixie in the Surge's roster. So that was a confirmation today. Any final thoughts on this before, we've talked about it, I think, on 3 straight episodes now, but do you have any other thoughts before we kind of get to move on and see what Neptune looks like with the Surge?
No, I think we've said everything. I mean, it seemed like, when the news officially or initially was rumored or reported on, um, basically was Neptune and Afro, the names thrown around. Huke and PRED situation drops, and that doesn't seemingly change anything. So I think that's the biggest surprise. I do still think I would have been, if they said Afro was the change over Neptune, that wouldn't have surprised me as much. But this is Neptune's shot. We got to see what he's capable of again. And we've talked about it numerous times with different players over the years. Like some guys in the CDL do not even get a second opportunity. There are some guys who are fortunate and get third and fourth and fifth chances, but there are other players who have one shot in the CDL. They don't do well, they get dropped, and then they either retire, go down to challengers, don't make it back up, or whatever the case may be. So Neptune is getting another opportunity here. He's got to make the most of it and got to show he belongs with the big dogs based on how he's played so far this year in challengers. It bodes well for him to have a shot, but this is next level of competition, so it will be interesting to see how he does. And we'll talk about the matches later. But another thing we always talk about with roster changes on this show, or at least I always bring it up, is you always want your debut match, whether it's your first CDL match or your return to the CDL, as is the case with Neptune. You always want it to be against a team that on paper is beatable, one of the bottom teams, or something to people talk about the honeymoon phase in the community and all that stuff. Well, Vancouver's got to play Atlanta FaZe, the defending major champions, in their first match with Neptune. So going to be tough to really gauge how well the new camp is gelling over there for Vancouver just after that one match and even just this weekend in general. But I will be interesting to see how him and O4 do together. Going up against arguably the best sub duo in the league. And yeah, it's gonna be a tough test, but I was excited when Neptune really got his first opportunity in the CDL. Um, and now I'm excited he's back, but I do think again this is one of those cases where he's got to make the most of it and got to show he belongs, or that this could realistically be his last chance in the CDL.
Per the Gamepedia page, this would be his first CDL match in more than 2 years. I believe his last action in the Call of Duty League was Major 1 of the NW2 season. So that started in late 2022. That major
Yep.
was actually in December of 2022. And that, according to his Gamepedia, was the final CDL event for him. And then he went down to Challengers, and he's been there since then. So obviously a pretty long time in between matches, but he earned his spot, especially his challengers performance and his team's challengers performance has been really good so far this season. So I'm looking forward to seeing him back in action in the CDL. So that we could put aside. The Falcons also made another roster change. They're kind of speed running these roster changes now. How'd you say he says it? Wixel, right? Wixel is his name.
I believe
WX.
so.
So Wixel will be moving into the starting lineup for the Vegas Falcons in place of Roxas. So this is what, their third player that they've swapped out. I think there's only been one player left, or I think it was a two-prong change and then this one, but maybe I'm wrong.
It's been several. I mean, they made a change at the major without even announcing it too. It's been a lot of changes. I think bottom line here, like Roxas has been one of the players who has struggled right up there with King of Bodhi the most. Um, so it's not necessarily extremely surprising. I don't think Wixel was doing much better, but you could be wrong on that. I'm gonna try to pull up. I had it in the notes last time, the breaking point stats for the whole
So their
regional
original
cycle.
roster was Exnid, Kix, King of Bodhi, and Roxas.
Yeah.
And then Kix and King of Bodhi were benched. That was during the break. And they were replaced by Doom and Wixel. Then King replaced Wixel. And now Wixel is replacing Roxas. So
Yeah.
Exnid, I think, is the only remaining starter from the beginning of the season, but they've made 4 roster changes at this point. And another part of this announcement was that Kix is indefinitely out. He remains indefinitely out, according to the Vegas Falcons statement. So you can look up on Twitter if you want to read that full statement. They said that our full support remains with him as he focuses on what he needs, and his place in the Falcons family will always be here when the time comes. Obviously, he was touted as the best player kind of by far on this team, and he's been out with personal issues since the break. So it's, and that's not helping their campaign necessarily, because they've won 4 or 5 maps total this season, and it doesn't help when your best player is on the bench. But yeah, so this is another roster change for Vegas. I don't think this changes anything in terms of their outlook, like one way or the other, to be honest, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on Vegas's latest change before the major 2 qualifiers.
The big thing I was going to bring up was kicks. I thought that was the most noteworthy here. There have been these multiple changes that you just laid out for everybody. And the big question, I feel like most people have always commented since he initially left the team, is where's Kicks, when are you going to be back? Doesn't sound like he's going to be back anytime soon. I do think, just based on how frequently Vegas has been willing to make these roster changes, that if and when he is available to come back, he'll be inserted into the lineup immediately, barring some incredible change of pace for the team where they're just going on a win streak or something like that. So I think he'll be back if he is able to be back. Obviously, we wish him the best with his personal situation and deal and all that. So, yeah, I think that's the big thing. I don't expect this to have a drastic impact on this team. It seems like they're really just throwing darts at the dartboard, trying to see what sticks, and nothing has really landed just quite yet for these guys. So we'll have to see what happens with the new squad. I do think, like I was saying before, Roxas did notably struggle, it felt like. So makes sense that him and King of Bodhi are the ones getting replaced by these younger guys who started in the academy scene. But it's similar to Neptune, this is really a big opportunity for these guys, just because, again, we've talked about it multiple times now. They're getting a chance to play against the best of the best on a regular basis, which is just something that the Saudi Arabian scene hasn't been able to do ever in competitive quality history before this year. So trying to get those reps in, if they're allowed to, scrim teams. We already talked about that last episode. And doing what they can with the situation they're in right now. We'll have to see how it works out. But yeah, like you, I don't think this is going to drastically change much for the Falcons.
last roster mania bit of news is actually not really. It's more of a development, I guess, or a reaction to the roster mania stuff. Obviously, we talked about on the last few pods about how PRED is back in the OpTic Texas lineup in place of Huke, who has been released by OpTic. And Karma, the head coach of OpTic Texas, was streaming today, or not today, earlier this week, and he talked about the change. He said, AG, PRED, is a shooter. It'll be about getting us on the same page. We got to a point when we were playing with Kyler, but there were still things we weren't 100% on, and now we have to restart that process. I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, that they have to restart the process, bringing PRED in. And we did talk about it on, I think, the pod two pods ago. I think on episode 150 maybe. But we talked about how like they only played 2 matches this season with PRED. Obviously, they do have all of last season as a roster together, but this is a completely different game, and they didn't have much practice. It sounded like even before the season started, or not consistent enough practice. That I think that was something that Shotzi had said as to why they might have lost their season opener. So they didn't have the greatest of practice before the season. They played 2 matches, and then Pred's gone, and he was gone for 2 months. That is concerning. That being said, they are still a really, really talented roster. So if you have to restart the process, it's great to restart it with 4 all-star players who have won championships together. What do you think about this? The idea that they have to restart, kind of getting back into shape together, so to speak. They have to kind of gel together and learn how to play together again.
I mean, it makes sense to me. Like, obviously, Karma's talking more big picture here, but just like for a literal example, the last time Pred played with these guys, Hacienda wasn't even a map, and now it's in the CDL map pool for all 3 modes, right? So, like that in itself is a change of just getting rid of the rewind practice and practicing a whole new map. And we don't even know how much Call of Duty Pred actually played when he was dealing with his personal situation. I think he was streaming a little bit or playing stuff in Australia. I think maybe there was like a tweet of Australian eights or something. I'm not too sure, but nonetheless, I just think that was one thing I talked about last episode or 2 episodes ago. I can't remember exactly when, but I thought the big thing with this roster change coming in is going to be a focus on communication, because like all of these guys are so talented, and that's what Carmen literally says, like AG's a shooter. Like you know what Pred is capable of on the map. He can get you a 1.2 KD on a consistent basis, all-star MVP caliber performances from a slaying perspective. But being being effective as a unit, and the small talk and calling out rotations, what spawns you're blocking, yada yada. Like that's really what I think for this team is going to be important. And I was really happy to, I guess not happy, but I just Karma in another clip said I think the biggest issue in Major One was comms. That was one of the main things we discussed as a team. So if they're focusing on fixing the communication, and before I even heard that, I was looking forward to hearing the communication with this new squad with Pred back in the lineup. I'm even more excited now to hear whatever listening we get with OpTic, just to see how things are going. JP's been posting some videos and stuff. There was one I saw that I didn't actually watch that was like a breakdown of a situation or whatever. So I might take a look at that. But like if whatever we get behind the scenes for communication wise for the squad, I'm going to be excited to break it down and see what we have, because that's what I think it's going to come down to for this team. How strong they are as individual players. We know how talented they are, and how they can outslay even the best teams in the game just from a pure slaying perspective. But it's how effectively are they communicating, how well are they gelling as a unit. That's what I'm really going to be interested in seeing.
It's kind of fascinating to think that a team that went 6-1 in the qualifiers, and ostensibly was the favorite or one of the favorites to win Major One, they had issues with communication, and according to the coach, they weren't 100% on some things. And it's not saying that every team is perfect even at the top, but it does feel like at least what Karma is saying, they did have quite a few issues and some kinks to work out before they went into Major One, and maybe those were just kind of brought to the forefront at the major, and maybe that's why the change was made. But I think it's interesting, and um, I just wonder how Huke feels about some of this stuff. Like, it just from like a human perspective, to be dropped from this team after winning 6 of the 7. Well, as far as when Huke was on the team, they won all of their qualifier matches and then they lost at the major. And then afterwards, the coach is saying, "Yeah, we weren't 100% and we had these communication issues." It's like, okay, you probably had all these issues before I was on the team as well, because that's just how things go. But I just kind of wonder what he thinks about all of this. And I think we should note, because we don't have any other roster mania news at this point, it seems like Huke will not be on a CDL roster heading into the Major 2 qualifiers, which seems odd, seems out of place. Maybe the roster change happened later than, it happened as soon as it probably could, but there's not a ton of break time here. There's like a week and a half, 2 weeks between the end of Major 1 and the beginning of the qualifiers. And it seems like there's only going to be 2 teams making a change, if I remember correctly. Three, yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot about OpTic.
Vegas and OpTic, yeah.
So only 3 teams are making a change out of 12, and Huke is not one of them. How surprised are you that Huke isn't on a roster heading into these qualifiers?
I mean, just based on how it happened and stuff, I guess like you got to think about that. And like I said, like the door was really open there for him to return to Vancouver Surge, at least from a just like a theory crafting perspective. Like timeline wise, they drop an SMG, Huke gets replaced on the same day. Like the door was there, but apparently they already were in talks with Neptune and whatnot, and they went that route. So I mean, just based on what we've seen from him this year as a player and how well he's played on an individual basis, it is quite surprising. I would be very surprised if he goes all of the Major 2 cycle without being on a team. But it might even be tough for him to get on a challengers team. But then, as I say that, I might forget a little bit.
There might be 5 roster changes to get Huke on a challengers lineup.
So yeah, it is kind of strange, but I do think he'll get another opportunity. And again, if he doesn't, I do think an NV/Empire/Astro org COD team with Huke, potentially with Huke and Illy. I feel like that's like just in the back pocket if it needs to happen. But I think that's down on Huke's list if he's even thinking about it. He wants to be in the CDL. He knows he belongs. He showed he's belonged, and he wants to have another crack. And I'm sure he'll if he does get another chance, he'll be very excited to play OpTic and potentially he's not one to ever really shoot bodies or anything like that, but it would be kind of funny if we got a Huke versus OpTic matchup and he like 180 turns on PRED and just shoots his body after and lets him know. That'd be kind of entertaining. I did see a clip 9 hours ago. At Spawn Up GG posted it. It was of 8s, and Huke like fries Kenny with an SMG. Presumably Kenny's using an AR on a red card, and he just says shit on after that. It wasn't like emphatic, really. I mean, it was a little emphatic, but it didn't seem like malicious. It seemed like it's just a shit on he would have said no matter who the other guy was, but it was kind of funny. And I just think big picture here, Huke deserves a shot, and not even a shot, deserves to be in the CDL. He's proven that. He went down to the challengers pit, started this year, dominated early on, got the call up. That was unexpected. And now he's just in limbo again. So, well, it'll be interesting. But, I mean, maybe like you said, maybe the minor is going to be the target window. If some people struggle these first couple of weeks, the qualifiers, and plays poorly at the minor, maybe that'll trigger some more moves. We'll have to wait and see. But I do think that, not like tooting our own horn or anything like that, but when we were doing like roster mania talk last week and just following Major One coverage, and we were saying like some of these teams could make a change. Maybe they might, maybe they'll do it after Major Two, yada yada. We couldn't really pinpoint any specific names or anything like that. I think that just speaks volumes to this roster mania as a whole, because like obviously other teams are, thinking along the same lines of it's just, 7 qualifier matches, 1 minor and 1 major. Like we made this roster months ago. We're going to ride it out at least 1 more cycle and see what happens. So, yeah, I do think Huke should be back very soon, and I hope so for his sake. But on which team it will be, who knows? If you told me at the beginning of the year Huke was going to be on OpTic, I would have been like, oh, that's kind of crazy. Something happened with OpTic, huh? So I mean, I'm not going to rule anything out. Who knows? I mean, who could be back on LA Thieves or FaZe at this point, and that's not totally out of the realm of possibility, I guess. We'll have to see.
Yeah, where my head is at is basically what you ended off with there, where you were talking about, it's only been 7 qualifying matches. A lot of these teams have played fewer than 10 matches or right around 10 matches total so far this season. So where I'm thinking is the optimism is still high enough for a lot of these teams that they still believe that the roster that they constructed in October or whatever, they believe that roster can still make a statement or do some damage in the CDL. I believe that not to be the case. I think that it's kind of like in traditional sports, teams overvalue their young players or cling on to those young players longer than they probably should have because they have like some kind of sentimental value, or they just don't want to be proven wrong by like giving up on a player or players. And that's probably the case for a few of these CDL teams, at least right now. I look at, yeah, I mean, Snoopy was a great example from last season, and maybe it'll turn out to be the correct decision in the long run for Boston. We'll see with that. But there's also teams that Huke is just not going to get on those teams. So we think of it as like, oh, there's 12 CDL teams. How does Huke not get on a team? But then you really look at the standings. Obviously, FaZe is not making a change. LAT, Carolina, Toronto probably wasn't going to make a change. OpTic, of course, made the change to get rid of Huke. So that eliminates 5 teams right there. He's not getting on the Miami Heretics unless he learns Spanish. I don't believe he knows Spanish. And the Vegas Falcons, probably not going to get on that roster either. So that's 7 right off the bat that he's probably not getting on. And then that leaves Minnesota, Boston, Vancouver, C9, and LAG. LAG feels like they probably could make a change right now, but they have the NYSL core, they have the former NYSL coach, and then a French player on the French org. Feels like they're probably not going to make a change at this point. Vancouver did make a change. That was the one that we talked about. Like, it did make sense for Huke. Boston, I just also like, we're not taking into account like why would Huke go to Boston, because it feels like that might be a move that he will soon regret basically if he goes there. Minnesota shouldn't make a change, as we kind of laid out I think on the last pod. And then I think that left C9 New York, which if there are 2 options, it would be Vancouver and C9 in my opinion. But C9 also has role differences that probably need to be worked out that Huke might not necessarily fix. And they also have the internet issues that we talked about that really make it hard. And it could sway a player. Like, these guys have already had all these troubles. And maybe, I don't know, Huke, I would imagine, is playing out of Texas. So he would probably have to move out to LA to be with C9. So maybe he doesn't want to do that. So there's a lot of kind of different factors playing in, but I wanted to kind of run those down just to, make sure that people understand that it's not really 12 teams in the CDL that need, roster changes or whatever. And that really limited the opportunities. And to compound that, like I said, there's only so much time between Major 1 and when Huke got dropped, which was a little bit after Major 1 to now, and, not having enough practice. So Vancouver seemed like the best idea, but it just, maybe the timing just was not right for Vancouver, and they decided to go with Neptune instead of Huke because of the timing. But, it's interesting. And I did say before the show that by minor 2, it seems like he probably should be on a roster somewhere. I think at some point in this cycle, whether it's, I don't know, maybe it's before right before Major 2, maybe it's before the minor, but I do feel like teams are going to start feeling the heat from, falling behind in the standings. Right now, it feels like, okay, we can make up any ground that we need to. If we're Vancouver or C9 or LAG, obviously Vegas, whatever. But like those other teams, they're in the bottom 4 right now, and they don't feel the heat because it's still really early. We're only like a fourth of the way through the season, a little bit more because we have the first 2 minors and stuff. But still, like those teams don't feel like they need to make a move right now, and they're not really making drastic changes. I feel like a lot of that will start to change over these next 4 to 5 weeks, where teams are going to feel like, okay, like if we don't do this now, we're totally screwed this season and we will not make champs. And they're probably right about that.
I do just quickly, I don't want to totally dismiss a Huke to Carolina move. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it would happen right now. But in a world where Carolina struggles in Major 2, we know Huke has that pre existing uh, chemistry with TJ and Slasher. It wouldn't really make sense from a role perspective for Huke to join the team in place of Vivid unless Gwyn or TJ or Huke was willing to play that second AR uh role. But if they also like, we talk about it with gentlemates, like playing a map like Skyline Hardpoint and running 3 SMGs, like having Gwyn, TJ, and Huke running around 3 SMGs with Slasher behind them on the AR, like that's kind of scary. And I know we talked about Vivid last week, and he actually played pretty well at the major. So again, I don't think this is something that's necessarily going to happen overnight here. But if Carolina does struggle early on in the Major 2 qualifiers and is looking to make a move, I could see it happening. It, again, doesn't make a ton of sense roles wise, but that, just past experience with Slasher and TJ for Huke. And we've talked about the hardpoint struggles for them since like the holiday break. Like you put in a guy like Huke who's had multiple like 30 and 15 games or whatever it is. I'm kind of talking myself into really liking the idea of that move. I just don't know how it would work from a rules perspective.
Yeah, I really don't think, like over the next 4 to 5 weeks, it really could change pretty quickly for like the majority of these CDL teams. I think Huke is not a candidate for FaZe, I would imagine, over the next month, and probably not a candidate for OpTic. That would be probably a little weird. But I think any other team, like it's realistic, maybe not like likely or anything. I don't think LAT is going to make a change, for example. But if LAT were to go like 2-5 in the qualifiers and really struggle after having like a really impressive Major 1, I don't think it is out of this world to think that LAT would consider picking up Huke to put in that lineup. For who, I don't know. But I mean, it would probably be Envoy. But like, but that's the only. But but I think Toronto could be in that scenario too. Like if they struggle, then Toronto tries to upgrade their roster with Huke. I really think most of these teams in the next 3 to 4 weeks could find themselves in a position where they are looking at Huke a lot differently than they are now, because they're looking at their own roster a lot differently than they are now. And, it really will depend. And I think that'll make it exciting. We kind of thought it would make the Major 1 qualifiers and then, the minor 1 and Major 1. We thought PRED being out there and kind of being looming or just on the outskirts of the CDL would make it a little interesting. And it did, but then he just went back to OpTic, and that kind of, I don't know, like I just thought it would be another team, but I don't think Huke is going back to OpTic, and that would be funny if he just replaced PRED and then they just keep doing that every major. They just keep swapping out that player, but yeah, I think it's going to be pretty interesting. And if Huke isn't, maybe he's picked up in a week, maybe some team is like, all right, screw it, like we're just going to go and we're going to grab him to make sure that we can upgrade this roster, but we'll see what happens. Let's talk about some power rankings, shall we? So like I said at the top of the show, it's been a while since we did our power rankings. I think if you just search it up, like in your whatever podcast feed you're listening on, or if you're on YouTube, you should be able to just like type in power rankings and it should pull up like however many times we've done it. I know we did it before the season began, and I'm pretty sure we did it after the second week of Major 1 qualifiers. So this should be the third edition of the power rankings, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think, I mean,
Sorry. Yes.
yeah.
So episode 135, we did our preseason predictions and power rankings. And then episode 140, we did final CDL power rankings of 2024. So that was probably during the holiday break.
Yeah, so obviously that was literally after 4 matches, I think, total, and those were all online. So we've gotten, to see more than double that now. We've got to see at least from, some of these teams, we've only saw one land match, but really we don't need to see a ton of them to give, and I should say this as well. The way that I view power rankings, and I said this when I think we did the first one, I don't know if I said it in the second one, but the way that I view power rankings is power rankings to me are who can win a championship or who is most likely to win a championship if the season ended today and the tournament started tomorrow morning or whatever. Because that's the only way that it makes sense to me. Other than that, like, it would just be who won the most recently, and like, let's just okay, like Atlanta won, and then LAT, and then Miami got third, right, or something like that. So like, yes. we just go I'd just go off of the major placings, and then we would just be done with it. We wouldn't need to really do any kind of critical thinking. Granted that the recent results are important, but it does not supersede what kind of our preconceived notions are of these teams, if that makes sense. So if you want to start with the power rankings, I'll pull yours up on the screen real quick, so people can actually see it and they can kind of criticize you and ridicule you for your silly little opinions.
Yeah, so I did a pretty basic layout for mine. S tier, I put FaZe and LAT. A tier, OpTic Texas. B tier, Carolina Royal Ravens, Toronto Ultra, Miami Heretics, and Minnesota Rocker. C tier, Boston and Cloud9. D tier, General Mates in Vancouver. And F tier is the lowly Falcons right now. I think for me, I'll let you get into specifics away, because I every time we do this, I always end up saying I like the way you're more specific with your individual, your naming of the tiers and whatnot. I just think, for S tier, based on what we saw at the major, and literally both matchups between FaZe and LA Thieves could have gone either way if you change things with just, one round there in the game 5, round 11, the game 7, round 11. So, I think both in S really makes a lot of sense for me. Both teams were probably the last time we did the power rankings. I know for FaZe, they weren't in S tier just because they were going through their little struggles early on in the qualifiers. So return for them. I think LA Thieves have been in the S tier all season for both of us. With OpTic, I think that's the way you kind of described it was, not being super influenced by the most recent result, or however you phrased it, not totally being influenced by it. I think that's the case for OpTic. New roster here with PRED back in the picture. We don't totally know what to expect, but I do, they were one of the top 3 teams heading into the season with this roster. So had to put them above some of these other teams that technically they're below in the standings. The B tier here, I think you could make the argument in my eyes for the second half of the B tier to be the front half of the C tier, and vice versa. I think that's a little interchangeable, but I've spoken very highly of the Minnesota squad multiple times this year. So putting them at the bottom of the B tier, I felt fine doing that. And then Miami, kind of like you said, the opposite of what you said, actually. I mean, I valued their third place finish at the minor and just had to, show them some love for that. So I think, that's where my head's at with B tier. But I think you can make the argument for some of these squads being replaced top of C, and I wouldn't, necessarily care much either way. Boston and C is probably a little surprising for some, but, just it's Boston and did well in the qualifiers, didn't do well in the major. So middle of the pack is, where they're at in my head right now. I'm probably a little lower than them then. I'm probably a little lower on Boston than others at this moment. And then Cloud9, I think, again, we saw a flash of what they're capable of at the major versus those online struggles early on. So C tier works for me for them. And then just Gentlemates, I still think the roster has potential, but they just haven't shown it yet. Vancouver, new roster with Neptune, don't know what to expect entirely. Um, so they're in D, and Falcons in F until further notice. They are at the bottom.
Yeah.
Don't think that needs much explanation.
Yeah, there's not much difference from what I said or what I put for my power rankings and yours. Obviously, there is some differentiation with like the middle of the pack, especially because that's really the hardest. Like the hardest group of teams usually to group are those like 4 to 9 or 4 to 10 or whatever, and that's probably the case here. Like you can make a solid argument for like whatever, like Boston should be in B tier because look how many good teams they beat in like the qualifiers. It was like a good showing for them. C9, like should they be in the same tier as Boston because they beat Boston, like so on and so forth. You can make all these arguments, but yeah, I generally agree with you. So my power rankings, like you said, like I do like the little titles or whatever. So let me zoom in and make sure that it comes up on screen. So it should be on screen now. So at the very top, I have FaZe. I did debate doing what you did and putting FaZe and LAT together in the top tier, but I felt like, if I'm going to do like a pick 'em for a championship tournament, I'm going to pick FaZe all the way through because they just won the tournament and, they beat LAT, and it just felt like despite how close it is, I would always be leaning Atlanta at least until proven otherwise, and that is the title of that top tier, until proven otherwise, which is kind of like our favorite our favorite saying for Atlanta FaZe throughout the duration of this podcast, dating back to when they were winning all of the tournaments. And then the second tier, I have LAT and OpTic together. Of course, that could change. Like I don't necessarily think that OpTic OpTic might take some time to get back up to the level that we expect them to. But if I'm just going off of talent and like what I think could happen in a given tournament, I'm always going to give OpTic that chance because they have so much talent. And I put them with LAT, and that is the Sunday stalwarts. Those three teams, Atlanta, LAT, and OpTic, I expect, unless a massive upset like we saw in Major 1 with OpTic, all three of those teams should be making it to Sunday without any exception. Just with all of that talent, there should not be an instance where one of those teams is sitting out on Championship Sunday.
And that's what we said going into the year, right?
Yeah.
Like we had a top three. Last year was top four for most of the season with Toronto in there with those three squads. This year it's last year it was New York in there instead of
New York,
but towards the end of the year. LA Thieves did well, but regardless, now we got a top three. Start of the year, that's what we thought. That's where we're at right now.
Yeah, and then the third tier that I have is a 2-team tier. It has Toronto and Carolina. These two teams are kind of hard for me to rank or to place exactly where they should be. I put their tier list as title threats because I do think that they can threaten for a championship. I do think they could have a great run and they could get to Championship Sunday. They could, maybe they could win. I just tend to think that they are kind of like the bridesmaid, not the bride necessarily, at least as currently constructed. Of course, these are both good teams. They should beat every team below them, like really without question on a consistent basis, at least from what we seen this season. But I just don't think that I think they're a solid demarcation line between the top three and the rest. I think everybody below them feels like decisively below them in general. Granted, Toronto did not have their best performance at the major, and then everybody above them feels like they are certainly above them. Next one is a step below, and that is the Miami Heretics and Minnesota Rocker. It feels like an insult to put them there. Miami, speaking of, like, because they just got third. Yeah. They proved that they are a good team at their best, but maybe it's just the Miami that I saw last season where they did have a good start to the season and then they took that step back and they just weren't that team. And I would also say that the ceiling for Miami is not nearly as high as it is for Toronto and Carolina. Same with Minnesota. Maybe that could change, but I can't sit here today and try to really convince you that Miami or Minnesota have a better chance at winning a major or winning champs or anything. They have a better chance than Toronto or Carolina, but they have a better chance than the rest of these teams. I have 4 teams in the second to last tier, which is the T12 danger zone, which, it's pretty self-explanatory. These 4 teams are always, at least at this point in time, in danger of getting first rounded and finishing without a single win at a major, which happened to a few of these teams. And, I don't think it really needs to be explained much more than that. Like, Boston did not have a great major. LAG had 1 match. They were out. C9 was not a first round team, but they feel like they could be. In Vancouver, obviously, they were not very good, and they're making a roster change, so we have no idea what they'll look like with Neptune. And then, at the very bottom, of course, it is the Vegas Falcons. There's no other team to put. They have to be in their own tier. If you have them in a tier with other teams, you're not being serious. So Vegas Falcons are in their own tier at the very bottom. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I like it. I mean, really the only major difference there is the breakdown between Carolina and Toronto versus Miami and Minnesota. I had them in one, you had them separated. So, and then the 4 teams you had together, I had in 2 different tiers. So, I think that just speaks to, how close things are right now. Also, kind of nice that we're somewhat similar on the same page. So yeah, I think as far as power rankings go, I'd be interested to see somebody with something very drastically different than what we just had in both cases. I can't really picture anything unless like somebody really knocked OpTic down just because like we don't know fully what to expect from the PRED roster, and they did get top 8 at the major before PRED, so I think that would be the only thing that would be like a massive shift in someone else's power rankings, but I'd have to see it and actually like I'd have to visualize it and see what somebody else is working with before I can even think about it. So I'm not really sure how much someone else could cook up with these power rankings right now.
Yeah, I think the biggest change would be Miami could shoot up power rankings because they have a 3rd place finish at a major, and then you could, like you said, bump OpTic down because they had a top 8 finish. You could even bump Toronto down because they had a top 6 finish. But I really don't see much outside of that you could like really argue and be serious about. Our power rankings in general kind of follow the standings of the season so far, with some differences. Obviously, like we both have OpTic higher than they are in the standings because of that major placing, but I just think we're going off of talent plus results, and sometimes that is not like the most scientific formula, so to speak. Like it is pretty difficult to do these power rankings. But yeah, my voice is going. I've never had this happen to me before, but it's been a lot of talking. So we're going to transition into the predictions portion of the show. First, Friday, February 14th, happy Valentine's Day to all those who celebrate. And if you don't, then just buy yourself something. So LAT versus Carolina is the opener, which is a pretty exciting opener, I would say, to start this week off. I think we're both going to go with LAT just because we both have them high in the power rankings and everything. I would agree. But yeah, you're going to LAT?
Yeah, I'll take LAT. I put here in the notes, there are a couple clips from Scrap's stream of him just, some friendly banter with him and TJ, and Dashy was in the call too. And, Scrap and Tej and I think Dashy, and I know Pred was involved, Temp was involved at the time too. In previous years and off seasons and even during the season, they have been like involved in some late night NBA 2K gaming that I've watched on some of these respective players' streams. So these are guys who are obviously close friends or just regular friends outside of like their teams and whatnot. So if you see any of these clips that were shared on social media, like Scrap and TJ talking trash, like it seems like it's just friendly banter, but um nonetheless that hypes this match up a little bit. We saw them play on day one of Major One, and that's when Vivid literally his eye looked the worst. It looked like it wasn't even open. And that's when the whole one-eyed Raven thing started, and Carolina got 100-point clubbed, almost 50-point clubbed, and 2 hard points by this LA Thieves team. Um, but then Carolina is able to work their way back to a fourth place finish. If they were able to get the job done against Miami on that Sunday, we would have gotten to see a rematch between these two in the losers finals. Obviously, that's not what happens. So this is the next best thing. We get this rematch pretty soon after it just happened. Different circumstances, online versus LAN. But I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I feel like Slasher was playing better online this year so far than on LAN, which is weird to think. Obviously, small sample size, but um, yeah, I'm excited for this one. Definitely a good one to start things off. A little bit of revenge if Carolina is able to get the dub. You might see some you know some quality tweets from TJ and Slasher on the timeline. But either way, post game interview should be a little spicy for this one, so that should be a good way to kick things off. But yeah, I'll take LAT here.
Next up, Boston versus Vegas. I think we're both going with Vegas, or both going with
Whoa,
Boston.
you're taking Vegas? I'll put it down.
no, my voice is going, and so is my brain, of course. But yeah, Boston, of course. Atlanta versus Vancouver is the last matchup of Friday. Both going with FaZe.
Yeah, gotta take Atlanta. This is talked about it very briefly earlier, but obviously Neptune's debut here against the defending champs. Tough debut for him with the new squad. But it's a good test. If he comes out frying against the team that just took a major one, that's a good sign of potentially things to come for Neptune. If not going to judge things too harshly if they struggle as a squad in their first match. Probably very limited practice heading into this already. But yeah, give me FaZe all day for this.
Saturday, February 15th, first match, Boston versus LAG. I'm going to go with Boston, but this is a tough matchup because LAG have not performed up to standard like at all. And but they've had some really close calls, and Boston has had some really close calls and come up on the winning side of a lot of those, especially in the online portion of the qualifier or in the online qualifiers. And they didn't really show up on LAN to that degree. But I'm gonna go with the Boston Breach and figure that they're just a qualifier team.
Yeah, I was kind of banking on you taking Boston here, so I'm gonna take Gentle Mates just to make sure we have something different. Um, I've like I said, I have not thought as highly of this Boston team as you have, and I do think they're a better team than Gentle Mates based on what both teams have shown us so far this year. But I think the potential's there for Gentle Mates, especially for them coming in first match for qualifiers for them. They have the opportunity here to set the tone for them to flip the script from what happened in Major One. So I'll take Gentle Mates. I do think Boston, if they were betting odds or whatever, Boston's probably the favorite squad. But I'll make things a little interesting from a pick 'em perspective.
Next up, we have Miami versus Minnesota. I'll go with Miami. We just saw this matchup on in Major One. Miami won 3-2, but Minnesota has proven to be a very good team and has about as good of a chance of beating Miami. That was the near full sale, if I'm remembering correctly, and
Yep.
So it's literally as close as it can get for that last map, at least. But I'm going to go with the Miami Heretics.
Yeah, I guess we're gonna have multiple different because I wasn't thinking about this one after, but give me Minnesota for this. Wouldn't be surprised, based on almost every series we've seen so far out of Minnesota, they seemingly love Game 5, so I wouldn't be surprised if this one goes Game 5. And maybe Minnesota will clutch up in this one, but I'll take Minnesota here.
Next up, Atlanta versus OpTic. This is obviously the big match of the entire weekend. I don't know if there is a rivalry name for this matchup, Certainly, I don't remember us making up one. Like we have E Classico, which is kind of on hiatus right now, and then we have the classic, the HBR Classic, LAT versus OpTic. But I do not think that Phase versus OpTic actually has one.
I feel like we came up with something and I can't think of it.
It would. I feel like it would have to be like something trick shotting related because they're like the two trick shotting clans or like the OGs or whatever. But I can't think of one off the top of my head. But either way, Atlanta versus OpTic, which should be a banger. We of course this is Pred's first match back, which is throwing him directly into the fire and OpTic directly into the fire. I'm gonna go with Phase, but I certainly can see OpTic pulling off the win here against Phase.
Yeah, give me Phase 2. Like you said in your power rankings, not gonna pick against them until they give me a reason to again. And we just, we hear in that clip we mentioned from Karma, they're going back to the roots, back to square one, trying to, start things off with Pred in the camp. So I expect this to be a tough debut for OpTic, but it should be entertaining nonetheless. I just think Atlanta will pull it off in the end.
Last match on Saturday, C9 versus Toronto. I'm going with the Ultra.
Yeah, I'll take Toronto too. I think the Toronto team plays from Toronto, and if they do, they play cross country against C9 in LA, as far as we know. So I don't know how much of a factor that'll be again. I really, it'd be cool if we just,
didn't have to talk about it.
C9 is moving to Dallas with most of the rest of the teams, and yeah, we don't have to talk about it, but it's gonna be something until it's not anything anymore. That was really worded poorly, but I can't think of any other better way to say it. So yeah, I'll take Toronto here. Based on what we saw from both these teams, most recently this could be closer in theory, with Toronto playing a little lower than what we saw early on, and C9 playing a little bit better than what we saw early on. So this could be like closer in that regard, but I still think Toronto is the better team right now, and I'll pick them here.
Sunday, February 16th, first match LAT versus Vegas, going with LAT.
Yeah.
Carolina versus Toronto. I mean, this is a tough one. I'll go with Carolina. I'm not feeling great about it, but it's pretty evenly matched, all things considered.
That's where my head was at. I looked at it and I was like, I can see myself picking both teams here. But Carolina just played really well in the qualifiers, the last time around, and I don't know. I feel like
the big difference is Toronto was the best hardpoint team, if I'm not mistaken, online, and Carolina
search team.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I don't know. Like I mean, I had them, I think, in the same exact tier, and
yeah, exactly.
It's pretty difficult to decipher, but
that's one I could see going either way. So one of us will be right at least.
Vancouver versus C9. I'll go with C9, but this is not an easy decision either.
This is one wow, I really am struggling right now.
Makes two of us.
On the other hand, to what we were talking about with Neptune's first match against Atlanta, this one is one that you would want to see as the first match against a team towards the bottom of the standings so far, beatable on paper for a new roster, and this could be a really good test for the new Vancouver squad with Neptune. So I'm excited for this one. I still think Cloud9 is a more talented squad, and Cloud9 should win this one. But I will be excited to see how Neptune shows out in this one.
Last match of the week, OpTic versus Minnesota. I could really see a Minnesota upset, but I will go with OpTic.
I could very well. I came not super close, but I came closer than I probably would have expected to putting Minnesota for this one, just because the next podcast with a potential theory, Jesus, a potential title of OpTic 0-2 in PRED's return, blah blah blah. That seems like a potential narrative that would be interesting to discuss. But I do think OpTic should beat this Minnesota team. I I think highly of Minnesota as a squad, and this is again they've been competitive with some of these teams that are quote unquote higher than them in power rankings and whatnot. Um, so if OpTic isn't fully prepared and they come in, you know, maybe a little tilted after they lose to Atlanta, or they just aren't fully prepared practice wise, communication wise, like Minnesota could take advantage of this because, this is a matchup. If, this is a fully practiced OpTic team with PRED, you expect OpTic to win this, but Minnesota been causing some upsets this year, so I'm not counting them out fully. I'll take OpTic and pick them, but should be an interesting way to end the first week of Major 2 qualifiers.
And that pretty much concludes the show. Pick'em records so far. Bink is 46-25. I'm 42-29. So just 4 matches, difference between the two of us. So it could be we had like 3 or 4 different picks in this round of pick'em. So I might make up some ground, or Bink might start to extend his lead a little bit as we get into the Major 2 qualifiers. Yeah, thank you guys for listening or watching. This was probably one of the rougher shows in terms of like mental gaffes, and my voice is kind of going as well. I've been a little sick over the past week, and I've been trying to drink water while we've been doing the podcast. But if I start talking for like 3 to 4 minutes straight, my throat just not there yet, I guess. But we appreciate you sticking through this podcast. Despite our flaws, or maybe because of our flaws, you're still here. Make sure to like or follow the podcast feed. Subscribe to YouTube, youtube.com. Just search up Ego Chall Podcast. I think we're closing in on 210 subscribers there. The goal is 300 by the end of the CDL season, so please help us reach that goal. And again, you can find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Amazon Music, pretty much anywhere that you get your podcast. You should be able to get ours. And if you could be so kind, please make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and maybe leave a nice review. Follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2 Ks, at Preston Byers. Podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBINKK. He is over a month straight streaming every day for, he's been streaming League of Legends. He's at day 34, 35?
Today was 35, I think, or something like that, but yeah.
So by the time that you listen to this, we're going to be closing in on 40 straight days of streaming. So please go give him a follow on Twitch. And we will be back on Sunday, February 16th. Not sure exactly when the live show will be on that day, because we've been kind of trying to schedule it around football for the last 3 or 4 months. But there's no football anymore, so we don't have to worry about that. So we might do a little bit earlier of a show. Obviously, we have to wait till the matches are done anyway, but we'll figure it out and figure our schedules out. Obviously, this show was probably one of the later ones we've done, at least in a while, but that's that's kind of how things are going with the work schedules and everything. But we appreciate you guys tuning in. If you want to tune in for the next live show, you can either go to twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast, or you can go to the YouTube channel, like I said earlier, and we live stream the show on both of the channels. So maybe we could live stream it on Bink's Twitch maybe one time, just to see if that would work. I don't know if that is feasible or anything, but yeah, we appreciate you listening or watching, and I'm gonna let Bink talk now.
Yeah, I almost just had a little mini panic attack because I just checked Twitter and I saw there was a notification I have notifications on for the CDL Twitter, and they had a tweet 5 minutes ago, and I'm like, oh god, well, did a roster move literally just get announced 5 minutes ago that we're going to talk about? And it's just a promo image for OpTic versus Minnesota, which is the last match we talked about. So, nothing breaking on that front as it seems. I mean, it is worth mentioning that, as is tradition with the Ego Chall podcast, whenever we do these shows, some news most of the time tends to break immediately after we do them. So some surprising roster move we haven't heard about could technically happen tomorrow. But based on everything we've seen and heard reported there rumors wise so far, I don't think that'll be the case. I think we should be in the clear, at least for this first week of Major 2 qualifiers. But yeah, pretty straightforward show today. Hope you guys enjoyed, had fun breaking down power rankings again and all that stuff. If you guys have any thoughts on our power rankings, if you guys would do them differently or anything like that, leave them in the comments on YouTube, and we'll bring them up on the next show. But yeah, other than that, we'll see you back here after the major 2 week 1 online qualifiers at some point. And remember to send the chow.